Welcome to another edition of Soccer Files. My name's Jason Longshore. Thanks for listening to us on the Soccer Down Here network. Let's get into something I've been wanting to tackle for a while now and something I've been putting in a lot of research on. We talked about Atlanta's bids for a Major League Soccer franchise and what led to Atlanta United being created. That leads to another bidding process that is a very important one in American soccer history, bidding to host a World Cup. Now, we know that the United States, Mexico, and Canada will jointly host the 2026 World Cup. FIFA former president Sepp Blatter recently said that the United States should be considered for the 2022 World Cup after the recent indictments of bribery relating to that vote that awarded the 2022 World Cup to Qatar. Don't see that happening, but this is not the first time that the United States has been involved in bidding for a World Cup or hosting a World Cup. We know about 1994. It's also not the first time that the United States has been linked to getting a World Cup that has been awarded to somebody else. And that's something we'll talk about in this little mini-series on Soccer Files. The United States tried to get the 1986 World Cup after Colombia had to bail out on hosting it. We'll get there in the second edition, but some things that I never knew about. I knew about some of the basics of the bidding for the 1994 World Cup. I know it was announced on July 4th, 1988. I absolutely know how transformative it has been for soccer in this country. I didn't know some of the particulars in the bid and some of the particulars in getting from being awarded the World Cup to hosting the World Cup. And those are things that we'll get into as we go. I had heard that late in the North American Soccer League's run, before it folded, one of the last things that it really worked hard on trying to achieve was bringing the World Cup to the United States in 1986. That was discussed in the Once in a Lifetime film. It was something that Warner Communications was heavily involved in, and a lot of people saw it as a lifeline to a North American soccer league that was really struggling at the time. Ultimately, the tournament was awarded to Mexico in a very kind of controversial format. We'll get there in the next edition, but let's talk about when the United States hosting the World Cup became I don't even want to say dream. The first time it was mentioned that I have been able to find, and this is not a surprise, would be 1969, when the United States Soccer Football Association made an announcement that it would make a formal application to host the 1978 World Cup. That was the next one available to bid for. 1970 was going to be in Mexico. 1974 was already set for West Germany. 1978 was the next one on the horizon in September of 1969. The USSFA had a meeting with its National Development Commission, and at that meeting held in Chicago during the weekend of September 6th and 7th, they decided to make a formal bid for the World Cup. That recommendation was forwarded to the National Commission of the USSFA, and they would formally apply with FIFA. There was also a recommendation that was mentioned in the media at the time about the U.S. hosting a, quote, World Youth Soccer Tournament in 1973. The Youth World Cup that FIFA ended up creating didn't start in 1973. I'd be curious to see if this was something that FIFA was going to push for, if it was something that the U.S. was going to create on its own. The first FIFA World Youth Championship, which is now known as the FIFA U20 World Cup, was held in 1977 in Tunisia. So was the U.S. trying to plant a seed with FIFA? Was it something the U.S. just wanted to do on their own? Was it just a crazy idea that was ahead of its time? Don't know. We'll see if we can find some more. In October of 1969, it came out that, well, the U.S. was not going to get the 1978 World Cup. Jeff Cross, who was a longtime soccer writer for The Province in Vancouver, wrote this. He said, quote, "That big promotion by the U.S. Soccer Association to bid for the 1978 finals has been squashed by a polite note from FIFA, the international HQ, stating that 1978 is already booked for Argentina." I don't know if the USSFA was just out of touch. I don't know if FIFA had not made their announcement. Little embarrassing. FIFA's note did say that the 1982 World Cup remained open if the United States would be open to making a pitch. Now, at this time, I don't think it was a hard and fast rule, but the World Cup alternated between South America and Europe. And this was around the time you were starting to get Africa mentioned. You were starting to get North America mentioned. And you were starting to see, well, maybe this European, South American flip-flop deal is not going to work in the long term. You know, you go back to 1950 in Brazil, 1954 in Switzerland, 58 was in Sweden, and it was after this one is where it really got going. 62 in Chile, 66 in England, 70 in Mexico, 74 in West Germany, 78 in Argentina. 1982 was expected to be a European World Cup. Well, FIFA told the United States that maybe, just maybe, that they would be interested in hearing a pitch. Leo Weinstein wrote for the San Francisco Examiner. He was part of the Stanford University language department and a soccer expert. He wrote in June of 1970 that Spain and Morocco were bidding for 1982. And Weinstein's article is actually really interesting when you know what happened after the fact. He wrote, quote, "This leaves America's earliest chance as 1986. Since there seems no hurry, the United States Soccer Football Association has put off, characteristically, until tomorrow, or even 1974, what it should be doing today." And he went on to talk about how FIFA was a very political organization. You had to curry the favor of the delegates to the FIFA Executive Committee. Leo Weinstein was absolutely correct. And he went on to write, "By the time the United States gets around to pressing its campaign, Colombia will have won support of enough delegates to have 1986 sewed up. Then 1990 will go to the European area again, which means the U.S. will be eligible in 1994. We should live so long." Now, this was in 1970 that Leo Weinstein finished his article with saying, "Perhaps FIFA is right in waiting until 1994. That could be debated. It ended up working out, but that could be debated. In the United States Soccer Football Association, which later became the United States Soccer Federation, did continue the push. July 19th, 1970, Ken Nigro of the Baltimore Sun wrote about the recent USSFA convention in Chicago, where the Federation decided to put in a bid for the 1986 World Cup. By this point, 1982 had been awarded to Spain. 1986 was next. And the USSFA was trying to grow up a little bit, as Nigro wrote. He said, "The USSFA, which long has been a shoestring operation, apparently has at last decided to get on its feet and do some kicking. The group, with headquarters in New York, plans to start a national youth league, hire a full-time publicity and promotion man, and a full-time national coach." Yeah, you didn't have a full-time national team coach in 1970. And the U.S. had not qualified for a World Cup since 1950. So no big surprise there. The North American Soccer League had went from 2 leagues in 1967 to merging to form the NASL in 1968 to 5 teams in 1969, 1970. They lost the team they added 2. They were at 6. They were supporting the Federation's efforts to bring the World Cup to the United States. Clive Toy, who has held a number of roles in American soccer, at this point in 1970, he was the director of information for the North American Soccer League. He said, FIFA won't make a decision on where to hold the cup until about 1980. So we've got 10 years to prove to everyone that we deserve to hold the World Cup. If we, in the next 10 years, make the game grow the way it has the potential to grow, then I'm confident we can get it. Now, the North American Soccer League did see a little bit of a bump in attendance during the 1970 World Cup. The games were available on closed circuit broadcasts. They were available, I believe, in Spanish language television. That was starting to become a little more common in the United States at this point. The World Cup has helped attendance, no doubt about it, according to Toy. He said, but I think the biggest effect of the World Cup will be felt by the game as a whole and not by NASL, and that's far more important in the long run. We can only be as big as the game. Before, we tried to be bigger. Now, Toy said FIFA would make a decision until 1980. Leo Weinstein had written that they needed to get going now, talked about 1974, which was the next World Cup after Mexico and West Germany. Generally, FIFA was making these decisions at World Cups. And by the time you got to 1974, and for me, and again, I'm not somebody who went through this, I wasn't born yet, I'm going back and researching it as I go. It's very interesting that there's really not much written about the Federation and anything mentioning a World Cup between the summer of 1970 and April of 1974. It just wasn't really being talked about. Now, soccer wasn't really being talked about in general. The NASL was starting to put things together. They were starting to get a little more solid. Phil Woosnam, the commissioner, was focused on keeping costs down, slowly building back up from the losses after the 1968 season. And it was very humble at the time. The Federation, as has been mentioned, really didn't have a whole lot of money. The first time they ever had a significant amount of money at one time was in 1967 and 68 when teams paid affiliation fees to the Federation. And the Federation sat on a stockpile. Didn't last very long. And by this point, they didn't really have a whole lot of money. The plans for a national youth league and a full-time promotions person, that stuff didn't happen. A full-time national team coach, the Federation went through 2, 3, maybe 4 coaches in that 4-year span. They didn't qualify for the 1974 World Cup. But it was at the end of April in 1974 that an Associated Press article had a quote from Clive Toye, who was the chairman of the executive committee of the NASL at this point. And the article was headlined, U.S. Plans Bid for 86 World Cup. Toye said, "We know that we have a long way to go, but the progress that we have already made is fantastic. We have a tremendous potential here, but to be part of world soccer, we need the help of FIFA. They help us, and this country could make a great contribution to world soccer." Colombia, as had been mentioned in 1970, Colombia had already made a request. They were already showing interest. By now, they had filed an official bid. Toye said that the U.S. had all the stadiums, all the necessary installations to host a tournament, and he was correct. But June 9th, 1974, it was Colombia who was chosen to host the 1986 World Cup. And according to reports, it was the only bid that was actually brought before the FIFA Executive Committee in Stockholm. So while the U.S. Soccer Federation and the USSFA, its predecessor, which was the same organization, change of name, had been talking about this since 1969, they didn't officially bring a bid before the executive committee in 1974. So 12 years before the 1986 World Cup, Colombia was named the host. Those 12 years, things would look very different in Colombia. Things would look very different for soccer in the United States as well. And that kind of takes us to the next chapter of this saga. So after Colombia was announced, the Sydney Morning Herald on June 11th, 1974, had an article about it and had a quote in that article, or a piece in that article that said, "The United States and Australia are bidding to host the World Cup finals sometime in the next 20 years, FIFA officials said. The U.S. and Australian bids will be presented to the FIFA Congress here this week." So trying to piece things together, it sounds like the U.S. Federation talked a big game, wasn't able to actually put together a bid, but did want to make it clear to FIFA that they were very interested in hosting a World Cup sometime in the next couple of decades. Now, you started to get a lot of different things being said in the 70s about future World Cups. In September of 1975, there were reports in the London Daily Express that Argentina would not be able to host the 1978 World Cup. And while there wasn't a direct mention of the United States being a fallback there, England and Scotland potentially were waiting in the wings to host it. Now, Argentina ended up hosting that tournament, and that tournament became the site for a lot of political maneuvering for future World Cups. Now, Canada, by this point, had gotten into the mix. May 5th, 1978, the Canadian Press had an article that said Canada wants soccer. They were sending a delegation to Argentina to the World Cup in an effort to bring the 1990 World Cup to the country. Now, remember the Europe, South America flip-flop that was going on. 1990 would have been, after Colombia in 86, a European tournament. And according to the Canadian Press in May of 78, Yugoslavia, Iran, and now Canada was expressing an interest, and they also mentioned perhaps the United States as expecting to submit formal applications for the 1990 World Cup. Again, I don't know if FIFA was clear in the process, if FIFA just left the door open and said, yeah, we have our way of doing this, but if you want to submit a bid, go ahead, submit a bid. We'll talk about the next one, whatever. Don't know. May 28th, 1978, the Associated Press ran an article entitled, Why We're Out of This World, in parentheses, Cup. You had 70 locations in 50 different cities around the country running closed-circuit broadcasts from the 1978 World Cup. Now, there was not interest in getting the whole tournament on domestic TV in the United States. Magna Verde was the company that ended up with the American broadcast rights running these closed-circuit broadcasts. Fred Landman, their vice president, said, the American networks were only interested in the final game. He said, maybe if Beckenbauer was able to play World Cup for West Germany, the American turnout would be better because of his exposure with the Cosmos. Soccer is certainly catching on in the United States among Native Americans. Minnesota, for example, is drawing people in the NASL with no major foreign population to speak of. But I don't know if they'll go to World Cup. In 1974, the previous tournament, Magna Verde spent $300,000 on a 6-day TV campaign to get American youth interested in the World Cup. And something that I've read a lot in these old newspaper reports, and something that makes sense in the way it played out later, Landman, among many others, said that if the national team is successful, that will drive the interest in the World Cup, but also the interest in soccer as a whole. By now, the president of the United States Soccer Federation was Gene Edwards. He said in the article, I feel we're very close to qualifying. And this was after the failure of qualifying for 78. There would be 2 more failures in qualifying before ultimately the national team did qualify for 1990. Just to show you where the Federation was at this point, Walt Chisowich, who was the head coach by now of the national team, said, our team was assembled on short notice. I was hired in August, and the qualifying matches were in September. There just wasn't a lot of time. Edwards went on to say, we have problems putting together a team that most other countries don't have. In a small country like Switzerland, you could whistle out the window and call a practice. Okay. Santiago Formoso was a defender with the New York Cosmos, played for the national team, was from the Kearney, New Jersey area. And he said this about the Federation not exploiting its potential home field advantage in playing Mexico. Now, they played Mexico in a World Cup qualifier in Los Angeles for this cycle. Didn't go so well. Formoso said, it was like an away game. We had the visitors' locker room, and then we got booed by the fans. We should make our home games as American as apple pie, like in Atlanta, Georgia. Why didn't we schedule a game against Canada in Tampa so the Canadians would sweat their socks off? When we played in Mexico, we played at 7,000 feet when they had stadiums at sea level. So why couldn't we have done the same thing? Why couldn't we have played the Mexicans in some cold place, like Minnesota or New Hampshire? The answer to that is the United States Soccer Federation wanted to make money because they didn't have any. They didn't have many resources to work with here. Even in 78, when the NASL was starting to hit its stride and start to bring in some larger crowds, the Federation wasn't really seeing much of that. Chisowich said that of the 43,000 in attendance in Los Angeles for the U.S.-Mexico World Cup qualifier, he said 40,000 of the 43,000 were rooting for Mexico. Formoso went on to say, we should be thinking about 1982 right now. For us to get into the next World Cup, we have to work 4 years ahead of time. Ultimately, did not happen. Phil Woosnam mentioned in the article that he was setting his sights on hosting a World Cup in the United States, and 1990 was the next one available, although the European South American flip-flop, it probably really wasn't available to the United States. Woosnam was the commissioner of the NASL, and the NASL in 1978 was in a pretty good place. From the article, and this was an Associated Press article in May of 78, here's a line from it. The International Soccer Federation, FIFA, has said that the NASL would have to make its rules conform with international rules if the U.S. is to have a chance to host the World Cup. The NASL, looking to bolster scoring, provides a shootout to break ties and has more liberal rules for offsides. They had the 35-yard line, and you could not be offside outside of the 35-yard line. So offside was only in limited portions of the field. FIFA didn't really like that. And a couple days later, actually the next day, in the United Press International article that I found at the Palm Beach Post, headline was, Soccer Group may expel the U.S. And Harry Cavan, who was the vice president of FIFA, said that the U.S. will be kicked out of FIFA unless the NASL conforms with international rules. So you've got the USSF wanting to bid for the 1990 World Cup, and you've got FIFA saying, well, we're going to kick you out because your top pro league isn't using the laws of the game. So after the World Cup, FIFA had a delegation set to visit the United States to try to resolve this controversy around that 35-yard line and the shootout. Cavan said, personally, I am delighted to hear football is beginning to attract large crowds in America. It will be a tragedy if the U.S. is kicked out of FIFA because its pro league refuses to conform with international rules. I can't see it being worth it. Phil Woosnam said that no FIFA official had come to the United States to see a game with the NASL rules. Cavan went on to say, the United States, as a FIFA member, has the right to submit rule changes to the technical committee. As we speak, no such proposal has been submitted. Now, it is too late, and they'll have to wait until the next Congress. And FIFA would meet every year on these sorts of things. Cavan also went on to say a couple things about the World Cup that were interesting at the time. This is in May of 78. He said the cost of staging a World Cup had gotten so large that it virtually ruled out any chance of going to 20 or 24 teams. Well, we know that didn't happen. Also, João Havelange was the president of FIFA. He was seeking a second 4-year term as president in 1978 at the FIFA Congress in Argentina. He was unopposed, so he ended up being voted into another run, and he wanted to expand the World Cup. So you had a little bit of a push-pull within FIFA about this, but the costs were getting very big to host a World Cup, and there was also the push to expand the World Cup. Keep that in mind when it comes to Colombia. Now, Jeff Myers of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch a few weeks later, June 18th, 1978, wrote an article entitled, World Cup in America, It's a Possibility for 1990. Had some interesting quotes from Federation members. Kurt Lamb, who was the General Secretary of the Federation, said, whatever we need to host the World Cup, we can provide. We certainly have the stadiums, the technical facilities, the hotel accommodations, and the people to watch the games. The interest is here. Now, Myers wrote this, and this was starting to get beyond the whisper stage and getting into the blinking light stage. Myers wrote, "There is also the chance that Colombia will not be financially able to serve as host and that the U.S. could get the games as early as 1986. Interesting. Myers wrote that Brazil and West Germany spent $5 million annually developing their national teams. The U.S. Federation had just begun to spend as much as $1 million, and a lot of that money came from the Coca-Cola Company, who was a patron of the U.S. Soccer Federation. Bob Gelker, who had been a previous president of the USSFA and had been involved in soccer in the St. Louis area for decades upon decades, he said, "Getting the World Cup here is not just talk. The effort is sincere. But there are a lot of countries bidding for it. What we need is the help of big business, and it looks as though we're starting to get it." Now, Myers wrote this, and we're getting back to the cost of the tournament at this stage. "What makes the U.S. bid for the World Cup even more attractive to FIFA is that Argentina practically had to go into debt to create the necessary facilities. By the time the games are through, Argentina will have spent about $450 million to build 3 new stadiums in large airports and construct hotels and roads. Approximately $50 million was spent on a color television installation that met FIFA's requirements, and I don't think was actually available in Argentina. I think people in Argentina watched that World Cup in black and white." Lamb said, "Compared with what the games cost Argentina, the cost of this country would be practically minimal." Now, not everybody in St. Louis was on the positivity train about the World Cup coming to the United States. Bob Brogue, who wrote for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch for a number of years, wrote about the World Cup finals, and it was available on closed circuit at Kiel Auditorium in St. Louis for $10 to go watch the World Cup final. Brogue wrote that the NASL was working with the Federation to bring the World Cup to the U.S. in 1990 or 1986 if Colombia had to give it up. He said that the World Cup final being on closed circuit was a bad thing for the game. It should be on TV to grow the game. And he was extremely skeptical of the U.S. ever hosting the World Cup. Now, Jerry Trecker, who is another longtime soccer writer, I wrote for the Hartford Courant, July 2nd, 1978, wrote about how FIFA did not award the World Cups for 1990 or 1994 at the Congress in Argentina. He did make a prediction, and he got 2 countries that have hosted the World Cup since 1978, and got one of them dead on. The other one, it took a while. He said, "But we'll make a guess for you. Russia in 1990 and the United States in 1994. Now, obviously, the Soviet Union in 1990, not really in the best place to be hosting a World Cup. It collapsed a year later. The United States in 94, Jerry Trecker is the first one I've seen to make that prediction that it would happen. Not that there was interest, that it would actually happen." In October of 78, Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State, was elected to the NASL Board of Directors. Now, it was a kind of honorary chairman role, but he said one of his goals was to bring the World Cup to the United States. Starting later that month, you started to get the whispers that had turned into blinking lights that were now full-on yelling about Colombia and 1986, and The Observer in London wrote that reportedly Colombia was due to withdraw their formal offer to host the 1986 World Cup. The expectation was that it would move to Brazil, and some of that was down to João Havelange being the president of FIFA, and he was from Brazil. The Observer article did have this in it, though. "But ears must be pricking up in the USA, too. By 1986, they could probably do it standing on their heads." Well, FIFA disagreed, as we'll find out. As you got to January of 1980, the FIFA bulletin that went out to its members included this quote from João Havelange about the 1986 World Cup. "In answer to certain rumors circulating in international press circles concerning the realization of the 1986 World Cup in Colombia, the decision to grant the organization of the 1986 World Cup to the Football Federation of Colombia is still in force." Now, how much did that actually mean at this point? It was. Colombia had not officially withdrawn. that actually took a while for them to make that decision. There were regime changes in Colombia. It kind of went back and forth. There were recommendations pretty consistently coming from areas of the government, though, that they did not have the financial resources to pull it off. João Havelange, in February of 1980, first started mentioning the United States and the 1994 World Cup. He said, if it is held in the United States, the championship game must be played on grass. FIFA would not permit the game to be played on an artificial surface. Havelange also not a fan of the shootout in the North American Soccer League. He said the shootout may be good for spectators, but not for soccer. So as the calendar turned into 1980, the United States Soccer Federation was pointing towards 1990 at this point, and probably in the back of their minds, 1994 was really the more realistic option because of the back and forth between continents of hosting the World Cup. 1990 had not been awarded by the beginning of 1980, and it was still up for grabs. Canada was expressing an interest. Yugoslavia was expressing an interest. You were getting interest out of the Soviet Union. I don't think Italy was completely in the mix as of yet, Iran, but the United States was in that mix. They had shown an interest in 1978, but it sounds like they were not officially a bidder because it had already been awarded to Argentina. They then showed an interest in 1986, but in 1974 it was officially awarded to Colombia. And according to reports at the time, there was not an official bid made. So the United States has talked a lot at this stage, early in 1980, about hosting a World Cup. They had not officially made a bid to FIFA. Now, that would ultimately change, and it would change a little bit sooner and in a different way than was expected. And we'll get to that in the next chapter of Soccer Files World Cup Bids for the United States. And you can probably come up with a catchier title, but that's the best I have. If there's other elements of American soccer history, you'd love for us to dig into on Soccer Files, please give us a heads up. Let us know with a message on Twitter at SoccerDownHere. We do have a special coming up later this week where all of us in the SDH network will be digging into how leagues in Europe bounced back from World War II. Because it's the only thing that's even comparable to what leagues will be doing to bounce back from this coronavirus and how they will handle getting back to action, what the format could look like. We'll see if there's anything we can learn from what leagues did in 1945 and beyond. So that's coming up later this week. We'll have part 2 of the World Cup bids from the United States as well. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks for spreading the word about soccer down here, and we'll be back with another Soccer Files very, very soon.